Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is February 9th, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you to lecture number 1435. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered at London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, which was the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your support. Without your membership, we would not be able to host the lecture series. If you are not yet a member, we request a one-time donation of 10,000 won or $10. We'll also take pounds sterling. Full-time student rate is 5,000 won or $5. Please refer to the donation page, which is on your screen, and also information in the chat box for PayPal and bank transfer information. Having said that, we would rather have you join us as a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up, and it gives you unlimited access to all of our events. Members receive discounts on RAS books, and you also receive our annual journal transactions. See our website at raskb.com for details. A link is posted in the chat box also. We are delighted today to have with us Ambassador John Everard, joining us from the UK. Ambassador Everard had a long career in diplomatic service and served for about 3 years as the UK ambassador to Pyongyang. Ambassador Everard published a memoir about his time in North Korea titled Only Beautiful Please. He says the title was based on continued requests from his minders to take only photos of the good stuff. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. So if you will be sure your mics are muted, we will turn the time over to Ambassador John Everard. John, thank you.
Okay, Steve, thank you for that warm and generous introduction. I'm going to show a few slides, if I may, coming up. Okay, hope everyone can see that. Firstly, thank you everybody for giving up your evening to listen to me. I appreciate the honor. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about North Korea. As Steve said, I was their ambassador for 2 years or so. I've also spent a lot of time dealing with the sanctions issue in North Korea as a coordinator of the United Nations Security Council panel. So I guess one way or another, I've been in and out of the place for quite a long time. But tonight, I want to talk about a few things. Firstly, North Korea from the inside. I was there, as I said, for a considerable period as ambassador, during which time I met all kinds of people, took all kinds of photographs, which I'd like to share some with you, and made a few observations. But afterwards, I've talked a bit about what North Korea looks like from the inside. I'm going to talk a bit about North Korea in 2021. This looks like a shaky year for North Korea. There's quite a lot going wrong. I know that if you live in South Korea in particular, you're bombarded all the time with reports of North Korea's missile and nuclear development. So I'm not going to talk so much about that. I'm going to talk about things that I think really worry the North Korean leadership. That's to say, the economic crisis that they face and the constant threat of COVID-19. And finally, I'm going to offer a few thoughts on why we need to be worried about North Korea, why North Korea is dangerous. Okay, so without further ado, let me start and show you a few photographs of North Korea. Houses. One of the things that we keep forgetting about North Korea amidst the flurry of news about missile tests, nuclear tests, and so on, is that this is a fundamentally poor country. This photograph was taken actually about this time of year, though several years ago, near Tanchon, so up towards the northeast of Pyongyang. Houses, as you can see, in a kind of rather sprawling suburb of Tanchon. Just a few things I want to draw your attention to. Firstly, outside lavatories. When I took this photograph, it was 20 degrees below zero, and you still have to go outside to use the lavatory here. Another point is what's not there. Your grandparents may have told you that in the old days in South Korea, you used to heat houses with yontan, with little coal briquettes. You still use them in North Korea, and they make a great deal of smoke. You'll have seen in that photograph, there's no smoke coming out of any of those chimneys. Whoever was in those houses was pretty cold that day. A poor society, also a very orderly society. That is a North Korean bus queue. A small point, you can hardly see inside the big blue bus there, but it's pretty full. I don't think many people in that queue got on. Other point is that I'm no great photographer. I'm no good at wide angle lenses, and I probably wouldn't have had time to fit one in any case. But the queue goes way off the picture, way off to the left there, where I didn't manage to shoot. It was a very long queue. People just stood, talked occasionally, no scuffling, nothing. A deep sense of order, of having to wait your turn. And this kind of ethos, if you like, is ingrained in North Korean society. But thirdly, and perhaps the most important of the points I want to make initially in this presentation, is that North Koreans are people like the rest of us. It's too easy to think of these people as automatons, as zombies almost, just completely thought controlled by a relentless government. And North Koreans fall in love and have boyfriends and girlfriends, just like the rest of us. I feel kind of guilty about this photograph. The young couple here was so deeply involved in each other, in whispering sweet nothings to each other, that they hardly noticed the foreigner coming up from behind and taking this photograph. I think they look quite sweet. Just one detail that you probably wouldn't spot from if you're brought up in South Korea. The anoraks, the coats that they are wearing, are expensive by North Korean standards, imported Chinese ones. Both the young man and the young woman there had dressed up for their date, which I think is kind of sweet. We often talk about North Korea as being a completely brutal society. In many ways it is. If you fall foul of the regime, you are in deep trouble, and the regime will treat its citizens in ways that are abhorrent to anybody in a free society. That's one side of the coin. But on the other side, at kind of ground level, if you like, it's a deeply compassionate society. This is a photograph of the two staff of an orphanage in North Korea. The orphanage itself is the thatched roof that you can see at the back there. And it was quite primitive. It was a thatched roof, as you can see, lino floor, open partly to the elements, with far too many children for the space available. But these two ladies looked after those children with a deep love and a deep compassion and complete dedication. They were always asking us for help, extra lino tiles because the lino in the floor kept wearing out, for food, for anything that we could give them. They were running the place on a complete shoestring. And I love those two faces. I think that you can just see the compassion and the humanity in the faces of those two women. They were, of course, or if they were theoretically paid for what they did, they almost certainly were never actually able to draw money. The North Korean economy just doesn't support orphanages that way. Recreation in North Korea. This photograph was taken some years ago, and recreational opportunities have expanded rather since then. There are now lots of new coffee houses in Pyongyang and places where you can just go and chat with your friends. But traditional forms of recreation in North Korea are still very, very important to North Koreans. The single favorite way of spending time in North Korea is just sitting, talking to friends. North Koreans talk and talk and talk. The conversation usually lubricated by almost industrial quantities of North Korean green tea. Without green tea, North Korea will simply grind to a halt. These people, however, are not just talking, they're playing chess. Now, Korean chess, of course, rather than Western chess here. Chess in South Korea, in most Western countries, is a kind of cerebral one-on-one activity. Not in North Korea, though. In North Korea, it's a group activity. And you can hardly see the players. They're so surrounded by other people who've come along to give solicitors an unsolicited advice. And actually, just as I took the photograph, the man at the back there in the blue cap had grown so exasperated with the players not listening to his advice, he simply reached forward and moved one of the pieces for them. As you can see, so completely absorbed in the game that they didn't notice me coming up and taking a photograph. North Korea is a beautiful country. Another point that is almost always lost in our discussions of the place. This is a beach. Well, you can see it's a beach. It's near Wonsan, the major port on North Korea's east coast. In fact, it's within shouting distance of the port facilities of Wonsan. And you can see white sand going all the way up. And right at the end there, you can hardly see the building. Just at the end is actually a kind of a beach facility for €1 a day. You can sit there, drink all the coffee you like, and there are showers and everything. And I do hope that one day people watching this presentation might be able to visit North Korea, explore the beaches and explore the mountains, which are unspoilt by tourism and unspoilt by industrial pollution. It's well worthwhile. Capitalism in North Korea. It's small scale stuff, and North Korean entrepreneurs always have a rather shaky relationship, should we say, with the North Korean regime. This couple were, of all things, running a photo booth. Photograph was taken on one of North Korea's public holidays, where North Korean proud parents love to get photographs of their children. Not many North Koreans have cameras, so what you do is you go along to an outfit like this, and you can put your child on the rather fine wheeled horse there that you can see, and the photographers here would take a photograph for, 100 won, develop it and send it to you. You can see that the business is treating them well. They are both wearing expensive, imported, coverall Chinese cold weather clothing, the envy, doubtless, of all their neighbors. I'm not a great fan of the North Korean educational system. It tends to teach people a lot of things that I disagree with, and it doesn't teach them things that I believe are important. Curiously, though, one thing that North Korean schools will always teach is how to sing. And North Koreans will sing at the drop of a hat. They are taught to sing from knee high, songs of praise to the god kings who've ruled North Korea since its inception. But it does mean that North Koreans will happily get up and sing without any kind of bashfulness in a way that Westerners find really quite uncomfortable. This was a village choir. We'd gone to help, quote unquote, with the rice transplanting, and by way of saying thank you, they came and sang us a few songs. And you can see they've actually managed to lay a hand on an accordion to accompany themselves. There's the accordion player in the background there. So quite a high day. Naturally, they asked us to sing a song back to them, and we could hardly scrape one together, which I still feel rather bad about, because they actually did sing really rather well. This is one of my favorite photographs, and it somehow illustrates the way that North Koreans will continue to press on and continue to do the best of a bad job, despite all kinds of odds piled up against them. The lady here is a pharmacist, way out in the wilds, up in the northeast of North Korea. She's sort of attached to a hospital, and she was very friendly, invited me in, gave me a cup of green tea, as North Koreans tend to, and we chatted. And I said, you're a pharmacist? And she said, yes, that's right. So you give people medicine? And she looked slightly uncomfortable and said, well, in theory, yes. She said, if I had any medicine, I would give them some. So I paused and said, you mean you're a pharmacist without any medicine? And she said, well, yes, the supplies just having to ride for months and months. So what do you do when people come to you for help? I said. Well, she said, what can I do? I pour them a cup of tea and I listen to their problems and I offer them sympathy. Maybe it helps a bit, who knows? I was actually quite impressed by this. And I said, do you mind if I take your photograph? And she said, no, that's fine, just take my photograph. And very North Korean, she quickly rearranged her hair and made sure that she looked her best. She said, just one thing, she said, the empty cupboard behind me, the one where all the medicine ought to be but isn't, you don't mind if I close it, do you? And I said, no, of course not. So she closed her medicine cupboard. She didn't mind being photographed, but she didn't want the world to see that her medicine cupboard was empty. When the great leader, Kim Il-sung, came to power, he promised the North Korean people that he would mechanize agriculture. And for a while, things went quite well. There were tractors, there was all kinds of mechanical plant to help bringing in the crops and processing them. Unfortunately, in the 1990s, everything started to go wrong. We talk about the famine, which of course was a horrible event, but at the same time, the North Korean economy and North Korean agriculture sort of imploded. There was a terrible shortage of imported fuel oil, which meant that North Korea, firstly, could no longer manufacture fertilizer, and it couldn't fuel the tractors that Kim Il-sung had produced for his people. So this photograph shows that life has gone back to a scene that you can see in Korean paintings of hundreds of years ago, people transplanting rice by hand, back-breaking work. You're standing knee-deep in filthy water, and there's lots of frogs and nasty creepy crawlies in that water. When we went to collective farms, one of the things they were always asking us for was boots, Wellington boots, rubber boots, so you didn't get your feet covered in filth when you did the rice transplanting. It's a tough life in the North Korean countryside. And there we see too, the tractors now laid up, no fuel, no spare parts come to that. And the hwangso, the red ox, which again, you can see in Korean paintings going back hundreds of years, pulling bullock carts, pulling plows in many instances, back at work here, putting a cart in the North Korean countryside. How times change. Back to tractors and now back to carts. North Korea, or at least the regime, is also quite a paranoid society. The rather strained-looking concrete oblongs there are tank traps. The idea is that if the South Korean puppet regime and the American imperialists who really run the place ever invade North Korea and try to drive their tanks up towards Pyongyang, that you would put an explosive charge in a little hole that is behind each of these pillars, blow it, and the pillars would fall across the highway and block the tanks. And these things are everywhere in North Korea. I showed this photograph once to a senior member of the South Korean military, who laughed and said that not only do they show paranoia, against modern tanks, they'd be completely ineffective. The tanks would just rumble quickly over the top of them. So not only paranoid, but useless. Hunger. 46%, says the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, of North Koreans were food insecure as late as 2019, and things have got worse since then. This photograph was taken a few years before that report came out. People who are hungry enough to risk walking halfway across the ice of the Taedong River that flows through the center of Pyongyang to drill a little hole in the ice and to fish through it. People do this every year, and every year some people miscalculate. The ice is too thin, they fall in and they freeze, they die. But people nevertheless think it's worth the risk to be able to come home with a few scrawny fish, some protein to add to an otherwise really very simple diet, which tends to be rice and vegetables for most North Koreans. A sad reflection on the state of North Korean food supplies. People often ask me what North Koreans know and think about the outside world. This photograph is a partial attempt at an answer. It is taken right up near the border with China. You can see the flat horizon there, and I hope you can see above the horizon skyscrapers, tall buildings. That is Dandong in China. What do North Koreans think of the outside world? Imagine what you would feel and think if you were standing where I was standing. This bleak expanse of harvested grain of some kind in North Korea, nothing there. And then just the other side of your field there, it seems, the skyscrapers of a different world, a world almost so close you can touch it at this point, but so different and so unobtainable. I went to the border town of Sinuiju, where I was not allowed to take photographs, but in many places in Sinuiju, the skyscrapers of Dandong look as if they are just at the end of your street, almost so close you could touch them, so close and yet so far. And this photograph, I think, illustrates the same point. This is taken from the other side of the border, the Chinese side. And the Chinese, with their love of show and of light, have lit up the bridge that crosses the river, the Amok River, across from China into North Korea. And you can see it's brilliantly illuminated. Then just at the border, it stops. And the darkness here, the other side, is North Korea. Now, if you are standing on the North Korean side of that border, looking out into the bright light of Dandong, what are you going to think? But for all the problems, for all the shortages, for all the hunger, the government propaganda machine keeps going. Here I photographed two men preparing a propaganda poster. This one, dated now, as you say, the son of the 21st century, Kim Jong-il, long live Kim Jong-il. But the same goes on today. I was always very cross to see that not only do they waste resources putting these posters up, but the posters always seem to require a concrete base. And in a country hungry for homes, hungry for building materials, that always seemed to me to be a crying waste. Propaganda starts early. This is a pop gun stall. It is right behind the main market in Pyongyang. And for 100 won, you can buy a dozen or so corks to fire from your pop gun at this figure. I think it's quite clear what the figure represents. The American imperialist wolves have landed, and it is your patriotic duty to stop them with your pop gun from taking over North Korea. Fortunately, as you can see, just for once, the Korean People's Army Air Force have found some fuel to fly their aircraft, so you have air support for your pop gun defense of North Korea against the American wolf. And this, of course, is aimed at children who are taught from very early age exactly who to hate and who to love. Diplomacy in North Korea is complex, challenging, and you spend a lot of time trying to get access to North Koreans, trying to tell the North Korean things that you know they don't want to hear, trying to get them to understand that a lot of their behavior is actually quite destructive. There are, however, big set-piece events in diplomacy in North Korea, including the flower shows. Twice a year, you are encouraged to go to a flower show in North Korea. Both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il had flowers named after them, and there are big celebrations of these flowers, one each year. But at the end of the flower show, you have to write something in the visitor's book. This is always a bit delicate because if you write something too critical, you will offend your North Korean hosts. And after all, there's no point being gratuitously offensive, whatever you think of the regime. If, however, you write something too gushing, then the North Koreans will quite cheerfully use that. You get a news bulletin that night saying, praising the great leader. The British ambassador wrote, there you are, you're quoted. So the European ambassadors, the EU ambassadors, always used to go into conclave before going to a flower show. And we fixed it so that only the presidency would write anything. He'd write it for all of us as a body. And we carefully worked out wording that was that struck a golden mean. There was neither offensive nor obsequious. Fortunately, we got away with it most of the time. Democracy in North Korea. Many people in the South believe that North Korea doesn't have elections. That's not true. It does. But unlike South Korean elections, North Korean elections only have one candidate. This, of course, has the huge advantage that you know who's going to win. And because you know who's going to win, there's no point getting tensed up around election time. You may as well make a party of it. This photograph was taken at a polling booth in a suburb of Pyongyang. And you can see that that they've launched a concert there. The children are singing, and proud parents, having cast their vote, have gathered. The weather was bad, as you can see, lots of rain, lots of umbrellas up there, to listen to the children singing. At that polling booth, I actually met the candidate, who turned out to be a very cheerful, friendly man, who typically North Korean, had a niceness of humor. And very seriously, I asked him what he thought his chances were of being elected. And of course, he saw the joke immediately. And looking equally serious, he said that he would, of course, deeply respect the wishes of the masses, but that actually he thought his chances of being elected were pretty good. There is no organized religion of the kind that you might understand in South Korea in the North. It is nevertheless, paradoxically, if you like, a deeply religious society, with the Kims having taken the place of the godheads of old Korea. This photograph is an act of private piety. The man whose back you can see here is on the steps of the great statue to Kim Il-sung in central Pyongyang. And he is sweeping those steps. Nobody is making him do this. He didn't realize that anybody was watching. It is simply an act of piety, an act of devotion to the god kings who run his country. And just out of shot, there's a little cupboard full of equipment, little brushes and so on, ready for anybody who wants to show their devotion to the regime in this way. Devotion to the regime, piety, is a very potent force in North Korea, and one, I think, whose power is often overlooked by outsiders. Another little bit of capitalism there. Bicycle repairmen. They were actually plying their trade under the arches of the bridge right next to the May Day Stadium. And they were actually very good. I took my bicycle for repair a few times, and the rates are very modest. They got a little bit confused over modern things like bicycle gears, but they were very good at improvising things and very happy to help. The traffic police women of Pyongyang, now an endangered species because they've been largely replaced by traffic lights, but an icon of their time. You had to get used to the hand signals they used. And basically the rule was that if you saw an arm outstretched, you were to stop. If, however, no arm was outstretched in your direction, you could proceed. These ladies always worked in teams of 4. They had little sort of booths next to the intersections, always the same team at the same intersection. And inevitably, as I cycled around Pyongyang, I got to know a lot of them really quite well. We used to recognize each other by sight. And friendly, like all North Koreans, they wanted to say hello. And so I'd wave as I I came up. But of course, it was always a bit difficult to wave if you were on point duty, because if you wave, that might be misinterpreted by vehicles and you might cause a traffic accident. So they perfected the art of kind of wiggling their fingers at me from under their gloves just to say hello and smiling as they did so without actually raising an arm. North Korea will tell you that it defeated the Japanese. Other historians disagree. They point to the effect of the atomic bombs unleashed by the United States, and they point to the effect of the Soviet invasion of Japanese-occupied China and then Japanese-occupied Korea in August 1945. This bit of history is simply whitewashed out of North Korean history books, but the Russian embassy in Pyongyang is not going to allow people to forget the Soviet soldiers who died liberating Korea. And every year they hold an event to mark their passing. You can see they are laying a wreath here in front of a memorial to these men. Every year they invite North Korean dignitaries and the diplomatic corps. The diplomatic corps, out of respect, comes along. No North Korean official ever attends. As far as North Korea is concerned, it's an official non-event. And just to end the slideshow, a reminder that I've tried to show the human face of North Korea, but it is a deeply unpleasant place in many ways. This is the USS Pueblo, overrun in 1968 on international waters by North Koreans and captured, taken as a trophy back to North Korea, its crew very badly mistreated, forced to sign confessions, and it is on display in Pyongyang. For 10 euros, you'll be shown around, shown the bullet holes of the encounter with the North Korean vessels, and shown the equipment that the North Koreans found on board. A rather nasty example of North Korean gloating over an almost certainly illegal seizure of a vessel, as I say, in international waters. That concludes my slideshow of photographs. One second, put the light on, please. Yes, put the light on, please. Yeah. I'm now going to move on to a few thoughts about North Korea. North Korea in 2021, as I said, is facing two big problems, the economic crisis and the crisis caused by COVID-19. The economic crisis first. Things are looking bad. We don't know as much as we'd like to know about the North Korean economy. Brave attempts at working out its performance, what is going on, tend to end in lots of question marks. But it quite clearly is sliding. I mentioned earlier that the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations reported just a couple of weeks ago that up until 2019, the end of the last reporting period, 46% of North Korea were food insecure. There have been bad harvests since then, and the situation is almost certainly worse. Official trade has come to a virtual halt. The borders have been sealed because of COVID-19. And there have been lots of restrictions against movement inside North Korea, which have almost certainly further hampered the economy. All this time, of course, North Korea has been under United Nations sanctions because of its missile, because of its nuclear programs, which are not always rigorously enforced. There's been a lot of leakage, but it is quite clear that the sanctions do have a certain effect, and they certainly worry the regime. That's a little bit about what we know. Why then do assessments of the North Korean economy tend to end up with so many question marks? There's so much that we don't know. One point that underpins a lot of the uncertainty is how much aid China is giving. China, of course, publishes no figures on this. We're pretty sure that China gives cash. We know it gives a certain amount of fuel, and probably without this aid, the the North Korean economic situation would be a great deal worse. We don't know either what reserves North Korea has, and if it has any at all. It may well have depleted them completely by now. Again, a certain amount of guesswork goes on. We are trying to monitor the civilian economy, but cash is constantly being drained from this economy to pay for North Korea's missile and nuclear programs. We don't really have much of a handle on how much these cost. These things do not come cheap and are almost certainly draining large amounts from the economy that's supposed to support a lot of very poor people. But again, we don't know how bad it is. Smuggling, the bottom left photograph there, North Korean smuggling across the border. It used to be extensive, heavily curtailed because of COVID and the North Korean attempts to lock the country down, but it probably still accounts for a certain amount of whatever trade is left. Nor do we know how much money North Korean workers overseas remit. Sending workers overseas to earn money has been a long-standing North Korean attempt to make foreign currency. But we don't know how many workers are overseas. The figures are published neither by the host governments. Of course, they're not supposed to be there anymore. The United Nations has banned this practice. And of course, the North Koreans aren't saying either. Those are what Rumsfeld used to call the known unknowns. We're sure there are all kinds of unknown unknowns, aspects of the North Korean economy on which we don't have any kind of handle. But the economic problems of North Korea don't just cause humanitarian issues. They also threaten threaten political instability. It's important to remember that right at the beginning of his term, Kim Jong-un promised the North Korean people that there would be no return to the arduous march. That is to say, there will be no return to famine. This means that if there is a return to widespread hunger, that his neck is on the line. It's the one thing that North Koreans always remember his saying. And if he doesn't come good on his promise, this will not look good for him. Up until about 5 years ago, you used to get reports coming out of North Korea of riots of various kinds, riots of all sorts of reasons, riots around markets were actually reasonably common. Those reports have stopped, almost certainly because the North Koreans have taken great efforts to prevent this kind of information leaving their country. But if the food situation gets really bad and you start to get food riots, I think there are real questions about how well the regime would be able to cope with these. The North Korean security apparatus are loyal at present. They know that for as long as they stay the right side of the regime, they're going to get paid, they're going to get rice rations. You can't count on that continuing indefinitely. Remember Ceausescu, remember how the Securitate turned against him. We can't be sure the same wouldn't happen in North Korea. Also, as economic stresses and the result of political stresses build, you can't assume complete regime cohesion. Way back, 10 years ago, a British businessman told me that when he went to North Korea in pursuit of a deal that never came about, he was astonished to find senior generals saying they thought that Kim Jong-il was an idiot and they just wished he'd get out of the way so they could run the place properly. That was 10 years ago. Things haven't really improved in that time. And I suspect that quite a lot of the senior members of the North Korean elite will support Kim Jong-un for as long as they believe that he is their best bet. But that doesn't mean complete and unconditional support indefinitely. While we're on the subject of Kim Jong-un, what's happened to him? From about March 2020, he ceased to appear in public for anything except for meetings that were absolutely essential, and went for long periods, not appearing in public at all. So he will chair meetings of the Politburo, he will chair other important political meetings, but the on-the-spot guidance missions that he used to do a lot of have almost disappeared. He still does one or two, but really very few. His wife has vanished from public view. His sister has seems to have been elevated, then demoted, and maybe making a comeback. You get the sense that there's a certain amount of turmoil at the top levels of the regime. And things will not have been helped, the final point there on the slide, by reactions to what we have to call now, I think, his failed diplomacy with the United States. He was riding high after Singapore, but after the Hanoi summit broke up with no agreement, he will almost certainly have set tongues wagging around the dinners of the elite in Pyongyang. North Korea has politics. It's not a simple top-down dictatorship. Kim Jong-un has to keep people sweet, and having failed to secure a deal with the United States will not have helped him. Of course, last month we held the 8th Party Congress, where he was elevated to General Secretary, and in the portrait of him there was shown wearing a military uniform that people who know more about these things than I think may well indicate that his military rank as well as his civilian rank has also risen. An attempt perhaps to boost him in the face of lots of bad news, maybe. But otherwise, faced with all the problems I've discussed, the Party Congress attempted to reassert state control over the economy. We know this doesn't work. The regime tried this in 2009 and had to back down quite quickly. It may mean that the regime tries to sequester money from entrepreneurs in North Korea to drain these enterprises of capital to pay for its own activities, which will almost certainly meet a wall of resistance, and in any case is killing the goose that lays golden eggs, a point the regime doesn't seem to have understood. There was no new strategy on COVID-19. The regime simply doesn't seem to know what to do about the virus. I'll be talking about that again in a minute. And continued defiance of the international community. No sign that the regime is prepared to back down in its threat to use weapons to achieve its political objectives. So a few words about COVID-19. The North Korean regime continues to claim that there are no cases of the virus inside North Korea. We know that this isn't true. Way back in as early as April last year, a North Korean defector crossed into China, and the Chinese routinely tested for COVID, and they came up positive. So they knew that there was COVID even at that point in North Korea. We don't know how widespread it is. We've watched the North Koreans lock down various places, continuing to limit its spread, because they know that if the virus did spread in North Korea, the North Korean healthcare system would collapse very quickly. It's in a parlous state at the best of times, and it would simply not have the resources or the equipment to deal with a widespread outbreak of COVID-19. And of course, North Koreans, as I've just said, food insecure, often malnourished, so compromised immune systems. The virus would spread like a prairie fire. We know that the North Koreans have been trying to steal vaccine secrets. We've caught them doing it on several occasions. And we know that they are trying to manufacture their own vaccine, which would be quite a technical challenge for them. But it's most unlikely that they will achieve this in any useful timescale. Under COVAX, they've just been promised a batch of British vaccine, of AstraZeneca vaccine, which, provided they can meet monitoring conditions, which is a big proviso, may well arrive in the next few weeks. But that will only be enough to vaccinate the top, I think it's 4% of the population. North Korea will really be struggling to find enough vaccine to achieve proper herd immunity to vaccinate its full population. It knows this. It knows that it's likely to come in the queue behind a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, for example, who are probably going to be more prepared to allow more intrusive monitoring of the vaccination process. So North Korea faces a real challenge with COVID-19. If the disease spreads before it gets its population vaccinated, it is in deep trouble. I said that I would say a little about why North Korea remains dangerous. I'm not here going to go into all the ins and outs of its missile and nuclear programs. I'm sure you've heard plenty about them from other people. But one point that I do want to challenge is the idea that that seems to be gaining ground, that North Korea just does this for show, that North Korea would not actually use a nuclear weapon in anger. I believe that this is a very dangerous assumption. And I believe this for three reasons. Firstly, the North Koreans in their negotiations with the United States, in the negotiation with other people for that matter, have consistently shown a lack of understanding of how the world works, of how to interpret what other people are doing. This raises the danger that they may simply misinterpret a signal from somebody else, particularly the United States, think that they are under attack and launch what they think is a counterattack. Remember that their nuclear doctrine is that they are prepared to use nuclear weapons if the honor and dignity of their republic is infringed. It's a hair-trigger nuclear doctrine, a very dangerous one. They reinforced that just 2 days ago by saying that they would, quote, thoroughly punish, unquote, anybody who offended them even a little bit. Now, that statement did not refer specifically to nuclear weapons, but they are quite capable of taking offense and becoming violent, according to their own doctrines, for what other countries might regard as insufficient reasons. That's the first reason I think that they might actually use a nuclear weapon. Secondly, a lot of people have argued that they would never actually use a nuclear weapon because they know that if they did so, they will be obliterated. I think this too is a very dangerous assumption. You are assuming that the North Koreans believe that Americans in particular are courageous and prepared to defend themselves. North Koreans in general have talked themselves into believing that Americans are weak, fat, lazy, and feckless, and that they probably would not actually dare to counter a North Korean strike. In any case, if North Korea obliterated, say, San Francisco, and then sent a message saying, if you counterstrike, we will destroy Los Angeles too, is an American president actually going to press that button? Would the North Koreans believe that he's going to press that button? I don't think we know the answer to either of those questions, and I don't think we should be making assumptions based on ignorance. Thirdly, it has been said so often that in the echo chamber that is the North Korean watching community, it's become a truism that the regime's basic wish is regime survival. Don't count on it. This was the mistake, remember, that American troops made confronting Japanese troops in the Second World War. They assumed that Japanese troops would fight, and then when their position was hopeless, they would surrender. They didn't. They fought, they launched suicidal charges. In the same way, it's entirely possible that if the North Korean regime decides that it's a goner, that it's not going to survive, that it prefers, in honor of its ancestors, in honor of its revolutionary traditions, to suffer physical elimination, going out in a blaze of, in this case, nuclear glory, rather than surrender. Do not assume that North Koreans think like you. They don't. Finally, just a few conclusions. The oak tree. At the end of East Germany, East Germans used to talk about an oak tree, their country like an oak tree that had become entirely rotten from inside. So from the outside, it looked normal. The bark was there, it still produced leaves, but in fact, all you had to do was to shake it slightly and it would collapse. Is North Korea like that? How badly has the internal structure of North Korea been corroded? How fragile, how brittle is the regime? We don't know. But I think it's an example worth remembering that regimes can look perfectly stable up to the point that they collapse. And experts back in the 1990s used to quite cheerfully predict the collapse of North Korea. This was, of course, during the North Korean famine. North Korea, of course, did not collapse, hasn't collapsed yet. That doesn't mean that it won't collapse. And because so many experts ended up with egg on their faces in the 90s, very few people want to predict collapse now. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to happen. On the other side, Adam Smith once said, there's a great deal of ruin in a nation. It takes a lot to make a nation collapse. There's probably a great deal of ruin in North Korea. And we may find that even in situations where it ought to collapse, it doesn't. What I'm trying to say is that we don't know. We tend to assume a steady state. We tend to assume North Korea just keeps going. It might or it might not. It might suffer what we call a sudden discontinuity. Meanwhile, as I hope I've explained, North Korea, for all the charm of its people, for all their friendliness, North Korea remains a real threat to all of us and a real threat to world peace. I've talked for far too long. Thank you for your patience. I'm just going to leave this slide of kitties on North Korea, the future of North Korea, on the screen there, for you to contemplate, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We appreciate your discussion. If you will look at the bottom of your Zoom window on a PC, at least, that Mac is different, I understand, there is an icon that will pop up that says participants. If you click on that icon, a box with everyone's name should pop up. And there's a function at the bottom of that box called raise hand. That's how we'll entertain questions. Okay. Smartphones are configured a bit differently. On my iPhone, I have to go to a more menu and then find that raise hand comment or icon. In the case your video is disabled or not available, you won't be able to do that. So type a question in the chat box and we'll try to get around to as many people as we possibly can given our time. So first of all, let's see, I've got a hand raised here from Russell Kelly in Australia. Russell, go ahead with your question.
Okay, right. Yes, look, being Australian, John, I'll call you John, being irreverent as we are. I'd like to pick up on something about the everyday people. Like I taught in Korea on Gangwon-do, and I taught a lot of the elementary school children, got to know some of their parents, and lived in this rural society where there were, you know, a lot of country people there. What I don't understand, and perhaps you can because you mix with these people, is why don't the elites have a conscience? How can they display their opulence in the face of their people suffering? Now, this divide between the elite and the plebs is just, I don't understand it.
I don't think the elite really have a big moral problem with this. They believe that they are the revolutionary vanguard. It's natural that the people will wish to reward them. And people in general, not just North Koreans, do tend to be very good at justifying why they are rich and other people are poor. We see this in all kinds of other countries too. When you talk to members of the elite about the ordinary people, it tends to be in terms not of, how can we justify being so well off compared to these people. The elite really don't worry about this. It tends to be much more, how can we make sure that these people don't rise up and we end up hanging from lampposts. I was constantly, when I shared secrets, so to speak, with members of the elite, they would sort of hold my hand and say, please, Ambassador, don't ever tell anybody outside the correct social circles that you might start a revolution. That is the way they think about the ordinary people, a kind of mass, probably rather frightening, not as human beings entitled to a standard of living.
Right. Okay, thank you for that answer.
Thanks very much. Pietro, go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. My name is Pietro. I'm a South Korean university student, and I have a specific question about the ideal attitude of the South Korean youth towards the North Korean dilemma, because it's quite easy to observe the cynicism around the peninsula, of the young, affluent, the prosperity accustomed people, and I believe that it's rather easy to go for us and think, oh, we are never going to unify, we're never going to become one again as our ancestors expected, as our ancestors wished. So I was wondering, I was thinking to myself that there must be so much more to this, and I was wondering what would sort of so to speak, the preparation, what would be the ideal attitude preparation for us as young South Koreans? Thank you very much.
Wow, what a question. I think firstly, never forget that these are Koreans like you. No, they are half of your nation. Because history has divided the peninsula, they may think differently in many ways. In many ways, they're rather like your grandparents. They're very conservative. It's a very conservative society altogether, North Korea. But you have to keep the end result, the objective of reunification in mind all the time. Second, I think you have to accept that this is going to be probably quite a slow and a very expensive process. North Korea is very, very poor, much poorer than South Korea. And its people have been locked away, so to speak, for a long time. If you simply took the DMZ away right now, you would cause chaos and probably a great deal of misery. If you look at the way that the few thousand North Korean defectors struggle to cope with life in the South, can you imagine the kind of problems that would emerge with those problems are multiplied by several thousand if the entire population is exposed to South Korea? You're going to have patience. You're also going to have to accept deep dives into your pockets. It's going to take a long time to rebuild North Korea after the depredations of the Kim regime, who have allowed things to pretty much fall apart. I mean, North Korean industry is in a shocking state. The train system is terrible. I mean, trains take days, not hours, to cross North Korea. The roads are rutted, and so on and so forth. So remember, these are North Koreans. Remain committed to reunification, but accept the fact that the road will be bumpy, slow, and expensive.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
John, as you were showing your slides, you had a picture of the tank traps, and we have the identical tank traps on the south side of the DMZ. They look like they were built from the same blueprints.
Okay, good.
Don't know how that happened. I have a question in the chat box from Brother Anthony. He says, or he asks, how do you see the effectiveness of ongoing sanctions? They seem to be causing much suffering in North Korea.
Yes. Firstly, let me declare an interest. I used to run the sanctions regime. So if I say that I believe that sanctions, problematic though they can be at times, are necessary, you've got to say, I would say that, wouldn't I? But there you are, I did. I think the sanctions aimed at slowing the North Korean nuclear program are indisputably important. The North Korean nuclear program has moved forward despite them, but I think it would have become a lot more threatening without the sanctions. The sanctions aimed at the wider economy. There's constant monitoring that suggests that they are actually having the effect of preventing money flows into the weapons programs, and not so much effect on the wider population. But yes, you are going to get collateral damage. I mean, sanctions of that kind are by their nature a blunt instrument. It comes down to how much collateral damage are you prepared to inflict in the belief that these sanctions are essential in forcing North Koreans back to the negotiating table. If we find that these sanctions have helped to prevent a nuclear war, then I suspect that most people would agree that what hardship they may have caused is justified. But it's a big if, and it's not a clear-cut question.
Let me go to one more question in the chat box from Pavel Om. Thank you very much for your presentation. You talked about the education system. How do you think if, oh, just a minute. Tonju families take care about education of their children. Do they use
Oh, sure.
to let them enter university, or aftermarket? They prefer not to let them study, what to help with business? What are your ideas about that?
Sure, yeah, I recognize the question. One of the strange aspects of North Korea that's very rarely focused on is there's quite an industry in private tutors. The Donju know that the state system is actually not too bad for teaching your child to read and write. Technical stuff. A North Korean state school will teach your child competent mathematics, for example. But you have to sit through lots and lots of stuff that the Donju know, although they're not suicidal, they're not going to go out and say, is a waste of time. The mythology of the birth of the Kim dynasty, and having to memorize political texts. So to try to make sure that their kids do have a reasonable education, they pay private tutors who will teach you English. They will perhaps teach you a bit of geography. I mean, there are clear limitations to what they're allowed to teach. And doing this is quite big business in North Korea. North Korean Donju children have to attend state school. Not to attend school gets the parents into trouble, but the parents know this isn't enough, and they have to expand the education at home after the kids come home.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Monica for a question. Monica, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and also Mr. Ambassador. My name is Monica, and I'm based also in London. And I've had the chance to visit North Korea on few occasions, first as a tourist, as most people do. And then also I've been invited by one of the NGOs, North Korean NGOs there. So I also, visited as a kind of a person who had a chance to visit different provinces in North Korea, because as a tourist, he cannot travel within the country. So my question to you, Ambassador, is whether your observations are based on one province, if not, which provinces have you visited there, and which provinces you didn't have you didn't get access to, because as I'm concerned, even UN agencies don't have the access to the North provinces. I believe there's only one UN agency, World Food Programme, which currently has got the access to North provinces. And also, what are the differences between provinces in your opinion? Because you've shown us a lot of pictures, but in some provinces, you wouldn't be allowed to take a picture even as a diplomat. Yeah, that would be me. Thank you.
Sure. I spent most of my time in Pyongyang, but I did manage to travel, not everywhere in North Korea. I think that would be too much to hope for. But to most provinces, I visited Hamhung, Chongjin, the western seaboard a lot. I was in Wonsan quite often. I was in Nampo quite often. I mentioned I went up to Sinuiju, Sariwon, and I went up to the northeast a few weeks before I left North Korea. I managed to see Chilbosan, which was nice, but also the northeastern cities there too. yes, the provinces are very different from Pyongyang. Pyongyang is much wealthier. You can see it in the buildings. You can see it in the streets of provincial cities, which are much shabbier. You can see it in the people who look as if they are nothing like as well fed as people are in Pyongyang. A lot of very pinched faces, and they dress more shabbily. Getting hold of decent clothes in Hamhung is much more difficult than it is in Pyongyang. Are you art to photograph? Curiously, it's actually easier once you're outside Pyongyang. North Koreans, they're friendly people. They're quite happy to talk to a foreigner, and provided you're polite and show due respect, they're happy with you photographing. I mean, most of the photographs that I've shown you, not all perhaps, but were taken with the agreement of my North Korean guides and escorts. They didn't like me to photograph military installations, so I didn't. But for example, the photograph of the rooftops near Tanchong, they didn't mind at all. And I've got lots of photographs also of downtown Hamhung. Really, provided you are not photographing something that they think shows their country in a really bad light, they don't mind that much. They are often quite happy to talk, and they will often quite cheerfully tell you about their problems, about how food hasn't arrived, how supplies haven't always arrived. I mean, they don't tell a visiting ambassador that they think that the Kim dynasty is not delivering the goods. They're not suicidal, but you can come away with a conversation quite often, understanding quite clearly that is actually what they think. A little bit of North Korean bureaucracy that often surprises people. People imagine that if Pyongyang says that a foreign visitor can go to a province, that's it. It doesn't work that way. The provincial authorities have to be consulted, and they have to give the go-ahead for a visit. And in North Korea, quite often you find that people don't say no, they simply don't reply. So I often found that I wanted to visit a province, that my colleagues in Pyongyang were quite happy for me to visit, but the provincial authorities just weren't interested and just wouldn't reply, so the visit couldn't go ahead. It's not quite the iron-hard dictatorship that people tend to imagine.
Okay, yeah, interesting, because if I may add something, like I think I felt like I feel privileged to be able to, let's say, to visit Ranseng province or not Hamgyong, where the situation is much more difficult than comparing to the southern provinces. And in those provinces, you are not allowed to take any photos, and people are not as smiley as you say. In Pyongyang, they are, because they're exposed to tourists these days. Well, maybe not over the last year, but prior to that. But in North provinces, the situation is much worse, and you can feel the real communism. I was born in Poland myself, and I heard a lot about communism from my parents and my grandparents, and that was actually the reason why I traveled North Korea for the first time a couple of years ago, and you can literally feel and see communism and in North provinces.
Yes and no. Certainly, as I said, they're much poorer. The northeastern provinces in particular are a great deal poorer. And there are parts of the northeast of North Korea where they are really very reluctant to let foreigners in. On the other hand, I mean, because you're so far from the centers of political control, people, paradoxically, are often much freer. I remember I was visiting a factory in Chongjin, and I arrived sort of a few minutes early, and the car sort of drew up, and I got out of the car, sort of outside the factory gates, and just sort of stood around, waited till the allotted time, because you don't want to pitch up early, it embarrasses your hosts. And as soon as they saw this exciting looking foreign car, a group of young women, maybe a half a dozen, gathered the other side of the street. And they'd never seen a foreigner before. This was real excitement. And they were simply sort of chatting themselves and giggling slightly. And I said to my escort, look, so let's go across and talk to them. And he said, yeah, sure, why not? I went across and said, hi, no, I'm from the British Embassy. How nice to be in Chongjin. How are you all? Just small talk. And we talked for the 5 minutes before my meeting should start, smile to each other, and I walked back in. That kind of thing, that would never happen in Pyongyang. If you tried that in Pyongyang, the police would intervene. In Chongjin, frankly, nobody cared.
Okay, great. I've got another question from the chat box regarding diplomatic presence in DPRK. Most Western countries have no diplomatic presence. What is the history of British presence there? And could you tell us a little bit about the kinds of activities, restrictions, or whatever that you could pursue while you were representing the UK?
Okay, we set up an embassy in, I think it was 2002, just at the end of the famine. There was a big push by South Korea, of all places, to encourage countries to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea, to engage North Korea, at a time when people thought that North Korea might be about to embrace political change. Of course, things didn't work out that way, but that's another story. And so partly responded to this, partly because we thought it was a good idea in any case. We arranged with the North Koreans for mutual recognition and to open an embassy, staffed originally just by a charge d'affaires, but muting into a fully staffed embassy after a couple of years. And we share a compound with the Germans and the Swedes. The United Germany inherited the huge, rambling East German embassy in Pyongyang, which had far more space than the Germans needed. So they sublet part of it to us and to the Swedes. And the arrangement worked quite well. What do we do? We spent a lot of time trying to talk to the North Korean regime, which is a bit of a minuet. I mean, they often don't want to talk to you. They certainly don't want to hear versions of events that contradict the official line. And getting them to brief you on things, you know, after big events. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Travel, the rule at that time, I think it's changed since, was that you are allowed, or they were allowed to travel within 35 kilometers of central Pyongyang. Nobody actually knew what central Pyongyang meant. And what it meant in practice was that you were allowed to travel up to the first line of military checkpoints around the capital. To go beyond that, you needed, in theory, a horap, you needed a permit. Though, you know, North Korean squaddies are quite often just let you through anyway. And on more than one occasion, I found that I'd gone through the line of checkpoints without realizing it and was trying to re-enter it from the other side, which causes some amount of confusion. We did quite a lot of project work. Helping orphanages, I showed one in my slides, visiting collective farms, that kind of thing, which generally sort of went down quite well, and trying to meet as many ordinary North Koreans as we could, which was easier sometimes than others. It's quite busy, and I'm very sorry that the British Embassy had to close in May last year because of the COVID sanctions. They simply weren't able to keep operating. I hope very much that it can reopen soon. I think a diplomatic presence on the ground is an important part of engaging with North Korea.
Great. Let me go to Che Dain. Please ask your question.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed the pictures that you have shared with us. I live in South Korea, and one of the pictures that kind of struck me a lot was the man cleaning the stairs, paying his respect, I guess, for the regime and the leadership. And I was wondering, after your comment about the lack of religion that I would be identifying with, in terms of, is religion illegal, or is this something that people just know? The only thing they know about believing in something would be the regime itself. Or yeah, and another point that I would like to hear about would be following up on the economic effort that maybe South Korea would have to take on if it ever thinks about coming hand in hand with North Korea, would be the kind of overcoming the reverence and the piety towards the leaders that the common public have in North Korea. Yes.
Wow. Those are two big questions you got in there.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine. Religion. Officially, religion is tolerated in North Korea, and there are churches in Pyongyang, a Catholic church and two Protestant churches, I think it is, where you can go. Of course, you can't attend full mass because there is no relationship between North Korea and the Vatican, so no official priests. But there is a service, and a, a friend of mine who was a practicing Catholic used to go there every Sunday and told me that she believed that a lot of the congregation were government stooges. They were just told to go along just to show the world that people go to church, but that some of the people probably were practicing Catholics. That they provided they didn't actually offend the regime, they were allowed to go to church every Sunday through, if not a mass, at least part of a service. And I suspect that the same goes for the Protestant churches. There's Russian Orthodox Church, which is real, staffed with real Russian Orthodox priests, which serves the Russian community in Pyongyang, but no Korean ever goes there, at least I never saw one. How real is all this? Let me try to answer that by an anecdote. A diplomatic friend of mine once went to a famous Buddhist shrine near Sarewan, which is kept open as a kind of museum and is supposed to be functioning. And he came across a Buddhist priest, a bonze there, and said, "Could you please tell me what it is that Buddhists believe in?" And the priest smiled and said, "Yes, of course, happy to do that," and gave quite a cogent summary of the Catholic creed. So my friend blinked and said, "No, no, Buddhism." And he realized that what had happened was that the man he was talking to that day was acting as a Buddhist priest because they knew a foreigner was coming. On other days, he acted as a Catholic, and he'd simply forgotten which religion he was supposed to be doing that day. Simply a fake for the foreigner. Okay,
Like
you also asked, yeah, for show, that's right, yes. You also asked a question about reunification and things. Do you want to try that again?
Yeah.
Your
So
second question?
in the question, I think by Paul, he asked that there will be tremendous effort on economic efforts that will be required if we were to have reunification, and the concept, and this would be what's on a lot of South Korean youth's mind. And yeah. I was wondering that after seeing your photo, it seems like not only the economic effort, but the kind of piety that the public has towards their leadership seems like an even greater problem or a greater issue that the reunification would pose. Yes.
Yes, that's right. Firstly, I know that in South Korea, a lot of people, if according to the opinion polls, are against reunification because they think it's going to be too expensive and for other reasons too. In North Korea, I never met a North Korean who wasn't in favor of reunification. Partly national pride, which is important. Now they believe that North and South together would be strong. To the Japanese and to the rather, but because my friend illegally watched South Korean drama, you know, the soap operas that perhaps some people watching today see on South Korean television. Okay, you're not going to admit watching dramas, I know, but a lot of South Koreans do. And North Koreans seem to think of these as almost like documentaries. That's what life in South Korea is like, which of course isn't the case, if only it were. And they want to be part of it. They think that South Korea is a wonderful, wonderful place, and can they please reunify? So there's a lot of kind of self-interest in it too. But it's not just the economy, you're quite right. You would have to slowly allow ideas, you know, to circulate in North Korea to challenge the orthodoxy set up by the Kim dynasty, to allow North Koreans time to digest all these ideas. North Koreans are very good at sitting around discussing things they've heard. And one of the reasons that they are, you know, often happy to talk to a foreigner is because if you have access to a foreigner in North Korea, then in your particular family group, in your group of friends, you can produce things, you know, share things with a group that nobody else has heard. And it really boosts your prestige in your circle. So foreigners are in demand. I said because there is a kind of emotional digestive process for ideas in North Korea, but you would have to give it time. You would have to give the society time to adjust to all the changes that you're trying to foist upon it, and to understand that quite a lot of what they've been told simply isn't true, and that there are different ways of doing things. One side effect of piety, and I always find these South Koreans uncomfortable, is quite a lot of people, particularly on the right in South Korea, say that they want to have early free elections across the Korean Peninsula. If you had a free election in both Koreas for a unified Korea today, then Kim Jong-un would be elected president. Everybody in North Korea will vote for him. Is that what you want?
Okay, we'll go to John Jackson. John, please unmute and ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, very
Sure.
good. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for your talk. Very interesting. When I was in college, I backpacked through Europe, and I was in Berlin. I had a chance to go through the, I guess it was Checkpoint Charlie. And on the West Berlin side, it was, I think, Saturday afternoon. It was really bustling. When I went through the gate to the East Berlin side, of course, it was a ghost town, so close to the wall. And I had a meal. Outside the window, there was a soldier with a Tommy gun standing. And when I walked out, I walked down a little, it wasn't small, but a side street. And it was empty. And I saw a young man leaning against a telephone pole and embracing his sweetheart, I assume. And it made a really great impression on me about what those two people felt between themselves in such a repressive sort of society and government and environment. And on the other side, I like to look at both sides of things. On the other side, in the novel 1984, which is about a, of course, a totalitarian government, the protagonist, I've forgotten his name, Matthew, of course, the thought police discover his greatest fear is rats. And he is in love, which is not allowed. And he is placed in room 101 with a cage on his face and a wire mesh door. And there are rats there. And he is told that these rats have been starved and he will either betray his love or the door will be lifted. And the first thing they will go for is his eyes, which is a very horrific image. And the novel ends with something I've never forgotten. Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me. Now in North Korea, if you have to say North Koreans, would they be on the side of human connectedness or on the side of human individual self-interest? And how would you compare that with South Korea, where people have liberty and, of course, much more individualism? I'm just curious. I've never been to North Korea, but if you were put on the, you've got to choose which side would you put the North Korean people?
I think one of the big dangers in talking about North Koreans is to talk about them as a kind of a lump, a homogeneous whole. They're not. They're all individuals. Which way would any North Korean go in that? That will depend entirely on the person you talk about. Some North Koreans betray their colleagues and their friends. Other North Koreans, through it all, remain fiercely loyal to colleagues and friends. You get all shades and all nuances. It's common in political meetings where you are supposed to criticize and to self-criticize, for groups of friends to go into conclave and have decide who's going to criticize who for that meeting and what they're going to say. It's all pre-scripted, which keeps the political cadres happy and means that nobody actually gets hurt. That goes on a lot. But on the other hand, if there's somebody you don't like and you want to damage, then denouncing them in North Korea gives you a whole sort of a weapon against them that that some people will use. A trivial example, a friend of mine got friendly, North Korean friend this is, got friendly with the young lady who operated the coffee machine that they used to give nice hot coffee to visiting VIPs. And she said, you know, can I try one, please? And the young lady said, yeah, okay, go on, have one. Unfortunately, somebody saw them do this, and she was denounced in a political meeting for having an illicit cup of coffee. And this kind of went viral, and she was threatened with losing her job, with all kinds of consequences. And in the end, it was all very North Korean by her having to go to her father, who was himself a high-ranking cadre, and getting him to make a phone call, just tell the guys to stop this persecution of his daughter, which of course is exactly what happened. And you know, from the next political meeting onwards, it was as if nothing had ever happened. Which way do North Koreans tilt? It depends on the person. And they're as varied from each other as Americans are and as South Koreans are.
We've got two more questions. The first one has to do with your ability to communicate in Korean. Can you speak Korean, or did you have a translator with you while you traveled in North Korea? And if you can speak Korean, what dialect do you speak?
Okay. By the time I left North Korea, I could speak quite passable Korean. I don't claim absolute fluency, but I could sit and talk to people, and did often. And you know, to have an interpreter present in a meeting with an ordinary North Korean would kill the conversation immediately. The interpreter, by definition, has been provided by the regime. He's almost certainly obliged to report back on the meeting. You just don't do that. I mean, you're getting somebody into deep trouble. You have to speak Korean to have that kind of conversation. On the other hand, at an official meeting, even with colleagues who spoke near native Korean, the North Koreans would always insist on an interpreter. They don't really like you speaking Korean at a kind of official level. It's a quirk of the system. What dialect? I came to North Korea having been taught Korean in the South. And I quickly realized that North Koreans, I mean, my Korean probably wasn't very good anyway at the start, but they were struggling to understand me. And I had to relearn a lot of the Korean I had learned. Learn to use all the initial North Korean consonants, learn to use the very formal forms of the verb that sound stilted in the South, but it's still very common in North Korea. And of course, learn to use the North Korean elisions and North Korean words. It's quite definitely Korean. I mean, you know, Koreans, South and North Koreans can sit and talk to each other, but you can hear straight away whether somebody's from the North or the South.
Like Americans pretending to speak English.
Yeah, if you like.
All right, I'm going to go to a last question from SB. I don't know, that's not a very good name, but I'll call you SB.
Thank you, Stephen. It's Sebastian Berger here.
Oh, Sebastian, okay.
Hi. Sebastian Berger here. I'm the Seoul Bureau Chief for AFP. We have a bureau in Pyongyang. I've been several times. For anyone who wants to know more about traffic ladies, I'm just going to share a piece in the chat group. Thank you for a lovely presentation. Your compassion for the North Korean people is very clear. I've got one very straight factual question and then a more involved one. Firstly, can you tell us how you heard about Chinese testing defectors who tested positive for COVID? Anything, I'm very curious about the sourcing on that. Secondly, in terms of your conversations with North Koreans, how far, in your experience, in your interactions, how far did anyone get to expressing dissent against the regime, against the mechanisms of power? Not about any particular situation or any particular policy, but the entire edifice. And you mentioned the generals under Kim Jong-il. Did you ever hear anything amounting to political dissent?
Okay, first question. I'm trying to remember, I read it in Chinese, which suggests it came out of somewhere of the Chinese media. This was April or so last year, as I said. To be honest, I'd be struggling now to find the exact reference. But it was, out of an official briefing, as I recall. I mean, it was, you know, the Chinese weren't, you know, this wasn't a leak or anything.
So a briefing to diplomats or the foreign ministry presser?
Well, no, I mean, at that time I was in London. So it would have to be, it would have been in the Chinese media somewhere. But where exactly I picked it up, sorry, I probably couldn't now trace it. Okay. On your second question, I was a foreign ambassador, so I would probably be the very last person that a North Korean was going to tell that they disagree with the regime. So no, I didn't get people saying, gosh, I think these Kim guys are just such a waste of space. I mean, you know, my contacts weren't completely suicidal. But what I did get quite often was questions and pauses where you understood fairly quickly where they were going. For example, after the first nuclear test, the 2006 nuclear test, 2008 nuclear test, wasn't it? Big one. No, 2006, right, first time, sorry. I had North Korean friends saying, you know, everyone went through kind of national euphoria for about a week, saying, yeah, we've done it, we've shown we can make a bomb. And then people would say, you know, how much does it cost to make a nuclear bomb? And there were figures floating around at the time, which I shared with them. And they go away, look thoughtful, and then they say, how much does a ton of rice cost on the international markets? And of course, they weren't, you could see what was going on, that they would never actually say, I wish that they'd spent this money on feeding us rather than developing a nuclear weapon. Yeah, you had to sort of deduce by hint rather than by direct statement. I suspect that in closed groups, that there's much more free speaking about the regime than outsiders tend to understand. Though that kind of conversation is never going to surface outside that group.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got to wrap this up, but there's two more questions in the chat box that I'd like to get to really quickly, John. I'd ask for you not to post any more questions because I won't get to them, I'm sorry. The first one has to do with the foreign community in Pyongyang. How close-knit is it? And then what's your opinion about the prospects of foreign entrepreneurs in North Korea? There was a fellow named Felix Apt who had a business school in Pyongyang years back, sometime during the time you might have been there. I may be pronouncing the name wrong.
No, sure. Okay, how coherent is the foreign community? When I arrived just after the foreign community had been decimated, in late 2005 to 2006, most of the foreign aid workers were thrown out by the North Korean security. It had been quite sectional. I mean, you know, there were bits of the foreign community that never speak to another bit. But by the time I was there, there were so few of us left that we all had to rub along. And this meant that you got to know, you know, Iranians, Russians, people you might not always come across in other diplomatic postings. You got to know people quite well. I was good friends with the Cuban ambassador, very nice man. So at that point, it was quite cohesive, and you would share information really quite freely. There was a big meeting every Friday morning for pretty much anybody in the foreign community who want to come along, where we always just compare notes. And I believe that is, well, is still the case for whoever's left. Entrepreneurs, large numbers of entrepreneurs have been fleeced mercilessly by the North Koreans. Joint ventures have been closed down very quickly once the foreign committed capital. There's been a lot of foul play. The Wonsan iron mine has been privatized and sold several times to people, all of whom sort of spent money trying to buy shares in it. None of them ever saw a return. So it's a very difficult market. Felix Apt, I knew Felix Apt. He's now left North Korea. I believe he's now in Vietnam somewhere. Did he run a business school? He ran a pharmaceutical business in North Korea for many years and was always a great cheerleader for business engagement with North Korea. But although he personally was very closely, I think, emotionally engaged with the North Korean people, I'm not at all sure that his business actually made much money for his parent company. And as I say, he did eventually leave. So not an entirely happy story. Thank you.
Okay, and the final question. Sounds like the game show, doesn't it? In Japan, there is the concept, I'm going to slaughter this, Tom, tatemai and honne.
Correct.
Yeah. Tom, just ask your question, please. Go ahead.
Okay, in various societies, but particularly in certain Asian societies, there's a very strong concept of public face and your internal feelings. So in Japan, they have a name for everything along those lines. They have tatemai, which is your face, your mask that you deal with people. And then there's honne, which is your true feelings. And Japan is a constant cocktail party, 24/7, when everyone's kind of interacting on a tatemai basis, but rarely do you have a chance to drop the mask and express honne. Koreans are kind of stereotyped as being overly honne compared to the Japanese. There's very little pretense compared to the Japanese. But I can imagine in North Korea, being totally honne as you might be in the South Korea could be existentially dangerous. But in Japan, you have an out, which is if you get horribly drunk, such as with your boss, you can let your hair SOB, and people will just kind of ignore it, and there will be no repercussions because, gee whiz, you're really, really drunk. Is there such a release in North Korea where a person is just off of their chest for the concept, or even when one is totally blotto, you are in serious existential jeopardy if you say what's really on your mind of a political nature?
You're breaking up a bit towards the end there, Tom, but I think I got the question. Yeah, sure. In North Korea,
Okay.
particularly if you are at work with colleagues, and of course in political meetings, you maintain a face. You keep your honne, you say it's called in Japan? Okay. Your personal feelings.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, to share only with your close family and close and trusted friends. And every North Korean has got a kind of circle around them of such people with whom you can share your most inmost thoughts. Getting drunk in the way that Japanese do, and which allows you socially to open up to people for whom you would normally preserve a face, happens a lot less in North Korea. Kim Jong-il rather, was notorious for trying to get people drunk at official parties to get them to open up, probably for all the wrong reasons. But you hear of North Koreans getting drunk with a circle of friends and having a riotous time, but they're probably people with whom they are going to open up in any case over green tea, let alone soju. So it doesn't really work in quite the same way.
All right, that's great. We've run a little over time. Thank you for your patience, John. Thank you for being with us tonight. We had a great audience. We reached standing room only level, so to speak, which is wonderful. Our the next event coming up in the RAS Korea calendar is on February 18th, next week, Thursday, 7:30 p.m. is our Korean Literature Club gathering on Zoom. The short story is Vertigo. Please see the website or Facebook for more details. Our next lecture will be Tuesday, February 23rd at 7:30 p.m. Join us by Zoom for a lecture by newly anointed Dr. David Tizard, who teaches here in Seoul and is a well-known television and radio personality in Korea. He will deconstruct K-pop and K-wave. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Good night.
Okay.
And good afternoon to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye then.
Best wishes.
Thank you. Bye.